Good evening. I'm Kate Garrity, the Director of Library Services here at Friends Free Library. And on behalf of the library and Germantown Friends School, I'd like to welcome you to our first ever virtual Community Writers Series event, Monuments, Walls, and the Heart of Democracy, a special evening with Paul Farber and Andre Robert Lee. Since its inception in 2013, the Community Writer Series has been a wonderful opportunity to celebrate the work of authors with ties to Germantown. The series is hosted here in Friends Free Library, one of the very first free libraries in the United States, serving both the community and Germantown Friends School since its founding in 1845. Although the library remains closed during the pandemic, we are so pleased that both of the communities that we serve have the opportunity to gather here this evening, albeit virtually. Tonight, we're lucky to be joined by two incredible individuals, author Paul Farber, GFS class of 2001, and filmmaker Andre Robert Lee, class of 1989, who will be in conversation this evening, followed by a question and answer period. Our author, Paul Farber, PhD, is the artistic director and co-founder of the Monument Lab, an independent public art and history studio based here in Philadelphia. He is also a senior research scholar at the Center for Public Art and Space at the University of Pennsylvania Weitzman School of Design. Farber is author of A Wall of Our Own, An American History of the Berlin Wall, and co-editor of Monument Lab, Creative Speculations for Philadelphia. Paul will be interviewed this evening by his friend and mentor, Andre Robert Lee. Andre is a keynote speaker and consultant around issues related to anti-racism, inclusion, and diversity for educational and corporate institutions. He's a filmmaker, and his experiences include working with the Ford Foundation, Miramax Films, Urban World, Film Movement, Diana Ross, BET, Universal, HBO, Picture House, and DreamWorks. His film, The Prep School Negro, will be airing on WHYY this Thursday, October the 1st at 10:30 p.m. He's a colleague of mine here at Germantown Friends School and has been key in developing a film program for middle and upper school students here at GFS. And now I'd like to present to you Paul Farber and Andre Robert Lee.
What a wonderful introduction from Kate. Thank you so much, Kate. Really appreciate that. And here we are. First, I'd like to say, before we begin, that we stand here in Philadelphia on the lands of the Lenni Lenape people. We are on lands that were stolen and built by stolen hands. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and state that at our beginning. So just put that out there and have us be aware and think about it as we go forward. So Paul, welcome.
Andre, thank you. It's so wonderful to be here with you and with so many members of the Germantown and GFS community with us too.
Yeah, it's pretty special. It's pretty special. I thought we start, as we talk about the books, I think it's important to talk about context and how we arrived here, so from your memory, how did we meet?
So I believe that we met in the fall of 1988 when I was a kindergartner at GFS. And after the school day, I would go to the after school program. My older brother, Ivan Farber, worked there as a counselor. And you worked there as a counselor. Years later, meaning like 6 years later, that was my first ever job as a sixth grader, was working there as well. But I have these really important memories of that, kind of not just extending the school day, but the relationships built with people there, and just remember you as really supportive then. And then thinking forward, other moments, not in kindergarten, but in college and after college, reconnecting with you and having the real gift of you as a friend and mentor you're one of those people that gets a hybrid word, friend-tor, because of that.
I love it. I like the hybrid words. Thank you for identifying the year. I didn't think I remember that it was 1988. That meant it was the fall of my senior year. It's been fun to meet people and say, yeah, I went to school with Paul Farber, and they're like, wait a minute. I'm like, yeah, he was a kindergarten when I was a big kid, so we have a connection. I remember rediscovering you. We had lost, I graduated, went my way, you went to high school, went your way, and I got something came across my desk about a student interrupting and disrupting situations in the sports department at UPenn. I saw the name Paul Farber, and I think I squealed like, yes, that's my dude. And it was so wonderful to have that rediscovery and to connect with you. I think we talked on the phone soon after that, and have since been building and witnessing. I've been witnessing your tremendous and great work. So once again, it's really exciting to be here, and I wanted folks to know how we connected and met with us being generations apart, which I think speaks to the institution and to our experiences.
Yeah, and I would just say, we'll be talking about books. It's really, it's really wonderful to be able to be here, and I see some of the names of former teachers and dear friends and classmates. So that is time bending in of itself, but a wonderful moment of full circle. I'll say, when you write a book, there's a lot of work that falls on your plate, but it's impossible to do it without a community around you. I think I see one of the names here, my dear friend Anna Morin, who's the first person who told me that I could write a book.
Nice.
And gave me that belief. But I also think, for you, Andre, you're named in the acknowledgments of in these books, and you not only talked to me about the books and were eager to hear the ideas as they were coming to fruition. When I had research trips to New York, and I needed a place to rest my head or charge my phone, you were there, but it was always about the exchange. So, it's nice to be able to talk about a book when it's finished, but it's even greater to talk with someone who's been so near and dear to the project itself.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's great. So let's dive into the topic, into the subject at hand. I'm going to start with the $750 question. Why monuments? Why do you do this work?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking through this question a lot, not just on an intellectual level, but like an emotional one, and kind of what drew me to the study of history. I do think back to the experiences growing up, going to GFS, and having, I think like the story of history clearly unfolding just in the cobblestone street of Germantown Avenue on the way to school, but understanding that there were all these layers and all these other stories that didn't fit in those traditional categories. The fact that George Washington's summer home was around the corner from Germantown Friends was less interesting to me in a way than the stories of the Underground Railroad and the Johnson House up Germantown Avenue. And so I think over time, for me, monuments, I'm drawn to them because they are places where the past, the present, and the future connect. And I think there's so much possibility that comes from making connections across generations. But I also, and as we know, there's so much pain, there's so much loss, there's so much trauma. And the monuments that we've inherited, largely those triumphant ones in city squares, weren't addressed to be places to transform ourselves, and yet artists and activists and everyday residents have used them and to kind of flip them and turn them around to be sites of gathering and empowerment. So I'm drawn to history, not just to recover the past, but really about how we transfer the past and what stories get lost, what stories get recovered, and how we bridge those gaps.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I've always loved seeing your mind at work. At 6 years old, it was a churning machine trying to figure things out, whether it was dodgeball or we were trying to figure out how to find balance and equity inside the walls of the after-school program. So it's exciting to see that mature mind tackle these complex issues. To go further with that, The title of this talk is Monuments, Walls, and the Heart of Democracy. Why the heart of democracy? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, we're in this moment of profound challenge in our democracy, and it's singular to this moment, but it's not unique in the sense that we've been in a struggle with democracy from the very beginning of this country's founding. We have yet to, not just with monuments, but with broader institutions, deal with the dispossession of Native American land, of the legacies of enslavement and segregation. We're not even talking about things that are fully past. This is the past, as we know, deeply intertwined with the present. I'm thinking about democracy as the act of voting, but something a little bit more than that. And I think we're getting a sense of that on an everyday basis, that voting is part of it, but understanding how, not just whether our vote is counted or not, but how it counts, how it signifies. This is a year where we're facing crises of repression and new forms of civic awakening and engagement, and recognizing how justice happens in and out of official systems. I think over the last few years, I've been drawn to studying border walls and monuments. I have thought of the two of them as distinct, but more and more they're related. I think about how I thought they were relevant, but I didn't want them to be as relevant and therefore as pernicious as they are now. But trying to think about these layers of what is democracy from the surface? What is democracy in its kind of most clear spotlight? And also, what is deep down? What does it take to build democracy? What does it take to disentangle or even reckon with the notion of democracy that's never been complete? And so thinking about the heart of democracy is meant to be a kind of push for us to think about both symbols and systems and how they connect.
That's fantastic, and I'm glad you ended with that connection idea, and all of us finding our way through this path and asking the questions. I think with your works, you ask us to explore these concepts and ideas. They're presented in numerous contexts, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to the books in a second. I wanted to pose share another moment of observation. When we first started talking about doing this event, you reached out to me and said, hey, should we pause? Because this was back in March, because we had planned this for the spring potentially. And you said, Andre, maybe we should pause. And I said, yeah, the country has re-erupted into protests. Can you tell me what your thinking was about that request for pause?
Yeah, well, so we were going to do an event at the Friends Free Library, and I hope we get to do it, special place. Right now we're there in spirit. And it was something we planned throughout the spring. My Berlin Wall book, A Wall of Our Own, came out March 13th. So all of the book that took 13 years to write, and you just have to shift and you move. And so we moved throughout the spring, and the book launch event was June 2nd. And that was already after the re-eruption of uprisings and civic protests in defense of Black lives and contesting systemic racism and police brutality. The first book event we did ended up being a teach-in, taking kind of the subject of the book at hand and working with folks like Salamisha Tillett and Grace Sanders Johnson and Axel Klausmeyer. We did a dialogue between Philadelphia and Berlin, in part because that was a way to utilize that platform and use our voice. Our event for this book, this conversation was going to happen a little bit later in the month of June. And it was yet to be promoted, but right in the midst of a really important conversation that started on Instagram, Black at GFS, which, echoed, for me as I'm white, Jewish, and queer, there were stories that I had heard from friends and colleagues, but it was really a moment to say, let's not, for me at least, I'll speak for myself, I don't think that an event sponsored by the school in this very moment will be read than anything other than taking up air and space from that, even if the intent is different. This is a moment that's a long time coming. Let it happen. We can push this dialogue. I think, in general, this is a question that I think a lot about is, when are moments to step up and when are moments to step away? The work that I do is devoted to contesting systemic racism and responding to bigotry, but I also have white privilege, even with my other outsider identities. So I've been thinking a lot about, it's very white to step up and try to fix and address things, and it's very white to sit back and do nothing. And so therein lies the ambivalence in figuring out what is right in a given moment. You may not always get it right. In that one, it felt like that was a time to step away. And even now, to make sure in our dialogue, when we talked about this, to give space for that conversation in particular, which is not done, it's ongoing, so that we have reference points and we think about the work that continues.
You make me think of a question that wasn't planned, but it's come up, and this is the exciting part of these moments. It may be a little challenging. You talked about the role of white people in these situations and the like. And as you talk about monuments, walls, and the heart of democracy, this may be towards breaking down certain walls. What do you say to white people who may show up to this conversation and say, I don't know what to say or do. I feel stymied, I feel stalled, I feel paused, and I feel guilty and bad and wrong. I ask that in connection with how you explain your thinking about the various ways of when to show up, when to pull back.
Yeah. It depends where that conversation starts, because there are some of those conversations that happen in confidence. There are moments that happen semi in public, in predominantly white spaces. And there are others that are in front of multiracial audiences. And so it's really important to think about that and address as it is. I'll say that part of, personally, I have these feelings of like, why did it take so long? And at the same time, welcome to the party. And I also know that some people may say that about me. The goal is not to be done. The goal is not to check off the box. It's about a long-term commitment. So the first thing I want to do is find space to break the taboo of not talking, of thinking that race is someone else's problem. Race exists somewhere else. I've been thinking a lot about Dr. King's words from the letter from a Birmingham jail, which is the notion that white moderates are looking for think about justice as the absence of tension versus the positive production of peace. But I want to try to have them think about the power that they have. So break the taboo. And then the next step is, where are places that you can address? You're a member of a church or a synagogue. You're a member of a parents group. You're a member of a community. Maybe hopping on Facebook and trying to work your way through the comments section is not going to be the most affirmative for you. But where are places of power that you have and you can just have the conversation? I think the last thing I'll say, I was really influenced by a few different people. I think about, my first and second grade teacher, Carol Corson, who I think is here tonight. And Carol Corson told us stories even in first and second grade of going to the March on Washington as a white Quaker woman. When I wrote my first paper at GFS, was about the civil rights movement, and I interviewed her, and I have a copy of this. It's laughable in many ways, but it's set from an early example of trying to know that you must act. That and it did dawn on me, though it's taken more time to see it, that this is not something that's going to end. We spend our lives doing it. There's another teacher I had who at Penn, his name is Nathan Smith, and this was in 2003, took a class on facilitating called PACE. And he said, when you do anti-racist work, and he's saying this as a white man, he said, I will tell you, you don't take it on for the semester, you take it on for your life. And so in the process, you'll gain friends, you'll gain family, you'll gain perspective that's rewarding, and you'll lose friends and you'll lose family. You'll lose people if they're not with you. So be really committed. So anyway, that's a lot of different ways, but I just think part of it is thinking about the long-term effect. I will say this, the final thing I'll say is this summer, my old friend from GFS, Jess Gars, we organized white people. I never looked through my phone figuring out who was white to talk to them, because even doing anti-racist work for a long time, it's still a tendency to universalize white people for me. And so I had not racialized those people. I hadn't thought of them as people to organize with. I hadn't thought about people to reach out to and talk to. And I think that was a big wake-up call, really being pushed by activists and artists, especially of color, this summer, to say, you gotta do this. So these conversations are happening. People can still be involved in those, but I just encourage talking about it and finding the right forums to keep the work going.
Thank you. You constantly give me so many I raise you right moments. So my little Pablito, I love it. I just remember that. I used to call you that. That was a fun little way of calling you. So let's move to the books. So for the audience that's watching, we're going to talk about the books. Paul's going to read a little bit, and then we'll open up for question and answer. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will moderate them and share them with Paul. So we got our books. I got them all marked up. I have some gratitude for people like Kate, librarians to me are the original Google. So I have to shout that out and put that out there. So I have just gratitude for them. But as we go into the books, let's start with a wall of our own. You talked about your favorite Leonard Freed, who made the cover. Can you also tell us about Angela Davis, who you talked about in the chapter 2? I'm going to read a quotation that ended the chapter, if that's all right.
Yeah. Well, I'll just share a little bit about the book, and then you want me to? I'll go read a bit from it. I went to do a dissertation. It is not something I dreamed of doing all through growing up. I had to really be kind of compelled to sit and read, but I had great teachers who pulled me in to the field of history and literature as well. So I did a PhD in American culture because I felt like the art, history, and literature kind of went together as a way to study society. I wanted to write 10 different dissertations, and I spent a summer in Berlin in 2008. And I realized I had one dissertation that crossed over all that terrain, because that summer I saw candidate Barack Obama speak to 200,000 people. I saw and visited not just memorials and monuments to the Berlin Wall, but of course to the Holocaust and to colonialism and to all these atrocities in Berlin, which I grew up never dreaming of going to. Because I was told it was too heavy with the weight of history. I kind of went there and actually recognized that the weight of history lives everywhere, especially across the United States. And then I saw, this is now the cover of the book, but I saw this photograph of an African-American soldier guarding a then 2-week-old Berlin Wall. And the photographer was Leonard Freed, who's a Jewish photographer, had left the United States in the 1950s. And wanted to understand that landscape of Europe after the Holocaust for his family and his relatives. And he went to Berlin when he heard the Germans were building a wall yet again and dividing themselves. And while he was there, he photographed American GIs, and he was haunted by that encounter and said, I have to go home because this is the contradiction of US democracy, that this is a soldier who is guarding democracy abroad and denied full citizenship at home. I saw that image that same week I saw candidate Obama, and the same month that I had been living in Berlin. And I kind of set forward on this idea of let me find all of the American Berliners along the lines of JFK, ich bin ein Berliner, not saying a jelly donut. He's saying I am a Berliner in a kind of symbolic way. And I just found the stories of so many artists and writers, everyone I wanted to write about in American culture, who had some kind of Berlin story, and they were either haunted by the city, they were at home in it, or a little bit of both. And I think it was, for me, what I experienced was the way that the scars of the city were not being hidden actually made it possible for me to walk it in a more sincere way. And Berlin is not without its problems, without its racism, without its legacies of hatred, but I felt more comfortable being Jewish and queer there than I did anywhere else in Europe.
Wow.
And so I came across stories, including, people like Angela Davis and Audre Lorde and Keith Haring. I found episodes of Alvin and the Chipmunks and Golden Girls. And I just realized that the story of the wall had been incorporated so closely into American culture. And I wanted to tell a story that wasn't good, bad, right, wrong, rah, 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 the wall came down, but instead really grappled with the way that the wall has been a place to think about freedom and repression for Americans since the days it went up. And even now that it's down, how it's a site of reflection. Just to turn it back to Angela Davis. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but before you do that, I want to, for the audience, any people out there, especially young people listening to this, you mentioned so much that reminded me of so many things. I remember when you had 10 dissertations and you would talk to me and I was like, what is this boy going to do? Because there's so many ideas. And I remember you sending the Golden Girls clips and Alvin and the Chipmunks and just digging deep. And it was powerful. I think I remember once you were in a castle in Germany there to study the German language to help with your writing and, connection with the literature and the experience. And it was such a moment of crystallization in terms of, and I say to people, there's a reason why a very small percentage of people in the world actually write dissertations. I think it's jumped from 5 to 7.5% in the past 10 years of the world that actually do this, because it's very hard work. And I watched you go through, and it's so powerful to hear you and to be in conversation with you now, to know that it was an incredible journey. And so for young people who are watching this and thinking about this, it's daunting, it's hard, it's wonderful, and it's possible. And the way you're talking about it and breaking it down, I think is really powerful. And for me, it's even more powerful because I sat there and witnessed it and was worried. And then when I remember you sent me a copy of this in a bound form before it was a book, a published book. It was your dissertation piece. And I was so honored to just hold it and look at it and talk. So I just wanted to give a pause for a second and say kudos to you and congrats on this journey that you've been on and the broad mind you've used to tackle it and approach. Now you can go back to Anna.
Yeah, thank you. That means a lot. And I was thinking in any talk, but especially, this talk, to be very transparent about the breakthroughs and the epiphanies and the challenges and the cliffs that you look down and hope you can, make it to the other side. That, this was a book that took 13 years to write. I've done other books in a weekend and other books in a month, but this book was old enough to be bar mitzvahed by the time it came out. And I think, it is really about the process, because you are writing. And for anyone who's a writer here, I mean, I've taught writing. I've, had wonderful writing professors. Every time I write, it feels like it's a new time. And I'm constantly trying to figure out how to make it easier. And it doesn't get easier because it's hard work, but there's so much in the process. And my life changed profoundly in the making of the book. And so by the time the book comes out, it's a little bit of a monument to its own time and process. It's not an end point, it's a beginning point. And so it's taken really to make that possible. People like you in my life, other teachers, other friends who made the journey possible, because it's not automatic. It's not like you can plug a USB stick into your brain. You see it clearly and then you sit down to write and it's a mess. And you just keep going back to it. It's a practice to be able to keep going back. And also just to say, as a tip, when you are reading fully, your writing flows. And anytime I hit writer's block, it's because I'm not reading. And I just noticed that relationship is something that, of course, there's time sometimes to put down the books and start writing. But they're so connected, and likewise, so is talking with people about your work. There's no book that you see as a solitary work, like no individual you see is a solitary unit, and no monument you see is a standalone figure. We're all a product of all of our influences, all of our tests, all of our connections.
When you are reading fully, your writing flows.
Mm-hmm.
That's a t-shirt. That's really fantastic. I think that's really a powerful notion to share. Thank you for sharing that. So talk to us about Angela. You were starting to talk about Angela Davis in this book.
Yeah. So so the book ended up being focusing on 4 American Berliners and their stories of moving in and out of Berlin and work that they made in Berlin that and experiences and encounters they had that would be fit into their work about American culture, especially around segregation, the US prison system, Japanese internment, and then Cold War politics. And each of the people that I ended up writing about, 3 of them, I should say, had deceased. And I made a decision as a historian and a critic to try to reach out to people who were close to them and deal with their archives when possible. One figure is still living, is Angela Davis, who I had met earlier, but had been, kind of working on her own show. And I talked to friends, and I talked to her lawyer, and I talked to other archivists. But what I found about Angela Davis, which was fascinating, was, she, in her autobiography, which was edited by the late Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, tells a story about crossing the Berlin Wall as a pivotal moment during her years as a graduate student in West Germany, the weekend that she spends in Cold War Berlin, which she felt far more at home in East Berlin than West Berlin, faced repression from the state while leaving West Berlin. But in East Berlin, met with family friends, James and Esther Jackson, who founded Freedom Ways, who were there for May Day, members of the Cuban Ballet, other folks from the African diaspora. And so in this passage, she never uses the words Berlin Wall. And what I found over time was that not only could I not find any instance where she used the phrase Berlin Wall, but the story of her in Germany and her connections to Germans, both of the former West and East, was profound. Her autobiography is dedicated to people behind walls. There were chapters called Walls. There was an epigraph, Walls Turned Sideways or Bridges, in that book, which I use in A Wall of Our Own. But I could never find a moment where she said the words Berlin Wall. In fact, Toni Morrison and Angela Davis in 2010 did a public dialogue about libraries at the New York Public Library, and Toni Morrison brings up the Berlin Wall. She says, isn't it something, I'm paraphrasing, when the Berlin Wall came down, all these other walls went up. I mean, we're constantly dividing. And Angela Davis engages everything she says, but she never says the words Berlin Wall. And of course, when I went back and saw, Angela Davis was a celebrated kind of guest citizen of East Berlin and East Germany. And it was against East German culture and really policy to even mention the Berlin Wall, because the wall was forbidden from dialogue, from sight. There was no wall. There was an anti-fascist protective rampart. And there were major consequences for even being close to it, let alone responding to it. And so Angela Davis, in a way, violates the code of East German society by even saying the wall in scare quotes. But I went back to the archives and saw these moments where she's taking a tour of the border area, is another name for that, and talking about repression that happens, and visiting those sites. And so what I've tried to do is say, like, well, why is it that she would even say the wall? I went back and looked at the manuscript pages and looked at Toni Morrison's edits and tried to understand why that was part of the work and what other walls she was pointing us to, which in the book is about the US prison system and the ways in which her own case, which happened, which of course happened after her time as a German exchange student, was impacted as well. So it was a way to tell the story of her in and out of Germany, but respect the way that Berlin Wall was not a phrase she would use. I found something very similar in the work of Audre Lorde, who never used the phrase Berlin Wall until after 1989, when the wall was dismantled. before that, she would just call it the wall or use other ways to talk about the divided city.
Wall of our own. That's powerful. Thank you so much for that, Paul. We're going to move to the monument book. But first, I want to actually throw in a question that came from a student, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So we'll push through and then we'll move into Monument Lab. I got my notes. From what I've read, this is from a student named Sonia. From what I've read, it seems that your work grapples with the role that public infrastructure plays in shaping the dynamics of our culture. As a GFS alum, how do you think that the physical structures on GFS campus reflect or impact our school identity? And how do those structures interplay with those of the greater Germantown community?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you said the student's name is Sonia?
Yeah.
That's a dissertation.
Exactly.
And it's really powerfully phrased. And there's so much there to unpack. So I'll try to unpack it from my personal take, but of course that's a conversation I'd love to keep having and being a part of. As I said, GFS is surrounded by this historical neighborhood, but one in which the kind of registers of history, what's on monuments, what's on plaques, has not caught up with the living history of the neighborhood. And there's been great efforts to address that. We worked with the artist Karen Olivier during Monument Lab 2017. I think about the work of Historic Germantown, of Stenton, to update that. But that's a truth, right? And of course, my former college professor and member of the GFS community, Mark Lamont Hill, it's amazing to see Uncle Bobby's as part of telling that new story. Dr. Hill was my professor when he was finishing his PhD at Penn, and I was very, very lucky to have experiences several times with him in the classroom. I will say, when you show this question, my mind goes in a few places. One, it goes to just something on campus itself. I remember the terms live graveyard and dead graveyard, and these were terms that made sense at GFS to talk about one graveyard that was actively being utilized and one that wasn't. But it early on was sending a message of the way that sites of memory are kept up and how we utilize them, right? And they were never separate. It was never like you weren't allowed to be there. You were encouraged respectfully to be in both of those spaces, but to recognize that even history on the personal level was still unfolding for people mourning or people making sense of the world around them. But I will say, like, my mind also went to something I just saw. I drove by GFS the other day because I live not too far away. And I saw a piece of artwork facing Germantown Avenue, right by the intersection of Coulter. I found out later it's artwork by a GFS alum, Jason Simonet, called 5 Boys, and it's a work about systemic racism. It features the outlines of 5 figures with clothes on several doors leaned up against a fence. And I thought about it as, I don't know if this is true empirically, but it's the first time I recognized that an art project, a project of communication, existed facing outside neighborhood and aiming for conversation. And whether or not that conversation is happening or not, that was a profound move. I always thought the entranceway, the Friends Free Library, was one of the few truly open portals on campus, but otherwise you have fences, you have locked doors, you have gates. And sometimes those gates are open and sometimes they're not, but they communicate a barrier. And so I just thought of that as a profound question about infrastructure, both what's symbolic and what's systemic, and wondering what the feedback loop is. Because again, even when there is not an artwork, the campus is communicating outward and it's communicating inward. And how to think about the porous boundaries of campus as part of something to think forward, right? And I feel like some of the conversations this summer around reckoning around histories of racism and exclusion address that. Like, what's the relationship to the community, and what are ways, again, there's probably more to this artwork that I don't know, but just even the gesture felt different. And I don't know, Andre, do you have a similar experience, or what?
Yeah,
are there parts of this I'm not picking up?
I saw it on Instagram. Jason Bird did the work, and I had to go drive by campus to see it in person. And I paused thinking about right where it was. You know, a GFSer knows when you go into school, you often look that way to see what's happening. You can see all the way up to the head of school's office. You can see inside sharply. You see the dead graveyard, the library's behind you. And it is an insider's entryway into the school. And it's also an outsider's wall, you know, from the school. It's a clear gate, but it's definitely a wall. And when I saw that piece, I was so moved by it. I sent an email to a text message or Instagram message to the artist, Jason, and he talked about, you know, how he just felt he had to do something and he wanted to express it and put up. He's never put his work up like that in these spaces. And this was the first time, and his heart was in it. He just felt like he wanted to. So it was powerful for me to hear him say that. And then in terms of this context of this conversation of the various monuments we have inside Germantown Friends and how they're perceived outside, I also think about the meeting house. The meeting house is old Philadelphia. You know, when you look up and see the structure and design, I often wonder what people who walk by think about what happens in there. So I think it's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful structure that may be intimidating if you don't know it. I know the school is making transitions. The front hall looks a little different now, you know, in terms of images that are hanging on the walls and this transition. There's one nice big surprise I can't talk about. I've already said too much. That's coming to the front hall, which is kind of fun. But I think your answer is fantastic, and I also really appreciate you shouting out and encouraging Sonia to keep asking questions like this and build that dissertation because he's on the way.
Well, and just ask the questions, no matter what your path is. Sona, that is you know, that's the kind of, and sometimes you're looking for people's responses, but actually I always think like the question will unlock so much. So I hope we get a chance to hear more of your questions and more of your responses too.
Right on. Okay, so let's go into the book. We have a couple more questions, but I want to hear your voice from this book. So this book, you've included some major figures, including two GFS alumni, Shira Walensky and Marisa Williamson, with some great pieces and work that I really appreciate it. It was powerful. And you know, let's actually have you read. You have a section to read to us. I think it's a good time to do that.
So this is from the essay How to Build a Monument, and this is one of the first essays in the book, and a collection of many voices and many artists. Hopefully we get a chance to talk about them. So this is in the book on How to Build a Monument. Imagine that every monument installed across the city of Philadelphia just briefly comes to life. Each statue, whether a mythological or historical figure, rendered in marble or bronze, positioned in a heroic stance or seated in repose, scattered across neighborhoods and municipal perches, loosens from its foundations. In turn, the busts of prominent Philadelphians blink and cast oblique glances as if to exhale. At City Hall, 3 distinct Benjamin Franklin sculptures on the north side of Broad Street look quizzically at one another, as a singular statue of the African-American freedom fighter Octavius Catto on the other side of the building completes a long step toward the site of his old South Philadelphia home. Beyond the statuary, voices ring out for recognition as the spirits of those namesakes at parks, schools, boulevards, and recreation centers clamor. A similar chorus emanates from historic markers placed outside famous Philadelphians' homes or sites of protest. The city is filled with noise and dust, generations of entangled mother tongues and musical notes. The living are compelled to pause, a grand reversal.
Wow. That's beautiful. It needs a quick pause after that. I thank you for reading that. That is a great introduction. I remember we're prepping for this, and you said this was meant to be read out loud. And as I listen, I go, yeah, I hear that. So I'm going to put 2 questions together and bring a conversation out that I think that came. And they come from 2 great minds. One is the parent of one of your college professors, with that wonderful last name Countryman, and the other is from Head of School Dana Weeks. So Joan made a discussion about the weight of history, and now that she lives in Philadelphia downtown at Front and Market Street, she's really faced with the truth of slavery in the North, which we often aren't, often succumb to us. And the question is around, could you talk more about the weight of history for Philadelphians? And then Dana's question was, the scars of the city are not hidden, is a word that she picked up, a sentence you heard you say she picked up on. Do you think the scars of our country were hidden? Do you see this as a root issue as we grapple with our history of racism? So what are your reflections on that, the scars of Berlin not being hidden, because why that was so powerful to you, and bringing this around to what Joan talked about of witnessing how powerful the slavery, the weight of history in America and Philadelphia.
Yeah, well, thank you for those questions from two powerful minds. And I do want to just, speaking of monumental figures, Joan Countryman, what an honor to even get a question.
Yeah.
And as, Andre, you noted, Matthew Countryman was on the admissions committee in my graduate program. And the reason I was able to pursue my work and really believed in me and was such a great gate opener and role model. And then I ended up teaching Joan's grandchild when I taught at Haverford. So there's a lot of major connections here. And of course, thank you to Dana Weeks for that powerful conversation. I want to kind of braid them together and think about it. I mean, I think I mentioned this, but I want to go back to it where, growing up Jewish, we were told never go to Germany, never think, don't do it. There's too much trauma. And I even knew a lot of people who were kind of going back to find their family roots in Europe, and they would zigzag across the continent to not go near Germany. And I went to Germany for the first time in 2004, before the trip I mentioned as a college student, and realized there were all of these German Jewish stories that I had not learned. And I wanted to know how in the space of profound trauma there was transformation, because I met Afro-German, Turkish German, I met expats from Israel who were living in Berlin and pushing for Palestinian rights and acknowledgement. And I said, in Berlin?
Wow.
Yeah. And I realized that, it wasn't that, while there, I felt like I was walking through something viscous, like it was so heavy with history, and I was there. I thought there's nowhere in the United States that is not carrying its own traumas, soaked with blood, soaked with ongoing pain, and that maybe I could use that opportunity and follow in the footsteps of other people to kind of follow that path. So I think to that intersection of Front and Market, which is a space now crowded by a highway entrance, but was the original parcel, of course, where William Penn's home was located. There is a historic marker recognizing that Philadelphia as a port was a place where enslaved Africans were brought here. There is a statue of Chief Tamanend of the Lenape, kind of positioned in a traffic island on the way down to I-95, that local activists and organizers in the indigenous community here in Philadelphia have been talking about moving or at least shifting. And I just think about that intersection and what kind of work of history is being done there. If you are reading a map from the Old City District, that is a place that you might be able to pick up on certain narratives that are prominent. Some of those narratives are in the history books or in kind of places of explanation, interpretation. Some of them are in monuments and markers. But there's so much that you can know about Philadelphia as a home of both freedom and injustice together at that site. It's very similar to the President's House at 6th and Market, just up the street, the site of the first presidential residence and the site of the first slave quarters. And because of the work of another amazing GFS alum, Erica Armstrong Dunbar, and my former day camp counselor, it's remarkable to have these monumental figures you get to grow up with. You see, the inspiration. Mm-hmm. But her work on Ona Judge, mm-hmm. which is channeled at that site, you cannot go to the Liberty Bell without understanding the legacy of this country, of the architects of American democracy were practicing slavery, and knowing, admittedly, that this was a broken system, but not making the changes systemically, right? And so that's what we're waiting for. That's what we're really pushing for, is to come finally full circle, to really understand how these narratives are entangled. I think part of what I found in Berlin is not closure. I didn't find that the story is done, but it felt like in the public landscape, on one hand, there was a response to the different kinds of trauma and loss, and not in the service of wrapping a bow and being done, but in the service of keeping it going. Mm-hmm. And likewise, accompanied by curriculum that was required of German school children for several generations about the education around the Holocaust, accompanied by financial reparations to Jewish families who were stripped of their homes and persecuted. So the symbols in these spaces can lead us to these other important systemic aspects. And I think part of what a number of our elected officials, I think of John Conyers as one who's pushed for a generation for just the study of reparations. And he hasn't been able to get that bill fully off the ground, but there are people who are pushing that forward. I think about a few years ago when a Republican-led Congress set out to read the Constitution and read the founding documents. And anytime that slavery was mentioned, they skipped it. So I think of that as a moment, not where the scar of history is given space to heal or grow, but it's a reminder, a doubling down of keeping the status quo in place. Mm-hmm. So as educators, as historians, as artists, even as residents of a neighborhood, of a city, what can we do to thoughtfully let history air out, to not work a wound, to not get in the way, but maybe to find out who are the people who have already been championing a new story in generations past and in our moment now? How do we listen to them and help them orient our study of history and the way that history lives, and not just prescribe a way to fix? I've this summer had the opportunity to speak to US mayors, which was fascinating. As an artist and historian, you get in that moment. And I said, I advise you to not rush to fix the problem as if it goes away. Rush to do the work of repair and listen and start from that point.
Wow. Yeah, phenomenal. I think that's really powerful.
Grateful for those questions and
yeah,
and to think about ways to keep answering them. There's volumes to say and there's volumes to hear.
Yeah.
From those two in particular.
We're getting close to time, so I'm going to cut back my reactions. I want to get another question in. I will say this. I think Joan Countryman may be the Quaker Kevin Bacon. And for people who don't get that, for pop culture, everything goes back to the Countrymen's. Like, there's always some sort of connection to the Countrymen's. And so, with this, we got a "Mama, I Made It" moment. You have the Honorable David Felsen pushing his demo tape to you, basically, asking you to read his speech, which we will take a look at. Dave, thanks for sending it. Paul has a copy of it. I have a copy of it also, so we'll take a look. But I like this question that David also presented. What person or event would you memorialize if you could? Where and how would you do it?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that in a few different ways. I'm going to answer that by saying the work of Monument Lab as a public art and history studio, we are looking to unearth the next generation of monuments. And we don't believe that there's one winner or one answer, but we want to see as many of those ideas out there, and whether or not they're built into bronze and marble monuments is not the point, because we want to actually rethink what a monument truly is and should be. But it is to make sure that we are rethinking common knowledge about our cities and our public spaces. And so for me, I've been really inspired when we work with groups of artists. I worked with 20 artists in 2017 in Philadelphia, including GFS alums Marisa Williamson and Shira Walensky. Last year in Newark, New Jersey, We worked with 4 artists, Jamel Shabazz, Manuel Acevedo, Sonia Clark, and Shakaya Booker. And we have a group of fellows around the country, in Richmond, in Chicago, in LA, in Charlottesville. Next year in the spring, I invite everybody in the GFS and Germantown community to join us up Germantown Avenue, or I guess down Germantown Avenue, as it were, at the Village of Arts and Humanities. We're doing a major project called Staying Power that opens May 1st with artists Sadie Barnett, Ebony Patterson, Dr. Deborah Willis, Black Quantum Futurism, and Mark Stranquist and Courtney Bowles, who've been collaborators with Andre as well, that asks the question of what is staying power in this neighborhood and what is staying power in a city that's rapidly changing. So those are my, actually what I want to see is more stories out there. But I will say, in the spirit of Oni Judge from, the book Never Caught, or even the spirit of, the monumental Joan Countryman, I want to see that question asked in every school, in every neighborhood, across cities, and not look for one figure like, if we've torn down a monument or we're going to budget for one, let's figure out who is the one, but to make sure that we spotlight, elevate, and join so many stories. So to me, I was in another city recently, socially distanced, and I was watching a mural going up. It was days after John Lewis left us, and there was a mural inspired by him, and the mural makers were like, we want to do something with John Lewis, and I said, this is amazing, and who else is going up there? And they named all these other figures who weren't from that city, and I said, well, have you asked anyone here, who's famous, who's noteworthy, who has been underrepresented but is known? They were like, what a good idea, we should ask. So I want to see that question of who would be more memorialized, asked in those spaces. And then we see maybe a statue should be built. Maybe there's a scholarship program. Maybe there's a day of service. Maybe this is an idea that came from the Monument Lab research. Maybe we should fundraise for that monument, design it, and then take the money and put it into the programs that person would have supported. All of the above are really important. And I hope that we see monuments and memorials as in their multiplicity, so that we can spotlight and elevate figures who are deserving of our esteem, or at least of our recognition, and work to remember that all of the notions of progress happen in collaboration and coalition, and the work continues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, once again, fantastic. I'll quote something written in the question section from one of our leading scholars, Mr. Alex Levin. He said, this has been a monumental conversation, and it truly has. There have been a couple of questions that we're not going to have time to get to because we want to respect our 8 o'clock time. But I want to say this, and partially in closing, and then allow you to share anything you want to say in closing. I've been getting lots of text messages and beeps and pings saying like, wow, this is so amazing, so great. And it's easy because I love you. I've loved you for a long time, and you're a really phenomenal and incredible person. And I've seen you grow. You've worked my nerves as a young person, and gotten to be great as an adult person, and see you really transition and change and stay committed to the process. I think that's something we say in Philadelphia. I'm learning this, moving back, and respect the process.
Trust the process.
Trust the process. Yeah, thank you. I received the knowledge. And luckily we did do that, and you were able to arrive at this space. And it's just so phenomenal to hear all the ideas, projects you have in place. I also wanted to make one little note that I was really happy to see the African-American artists you centered in this book, along with many other artists of different backgrounds and perspectives. Because it is that moment. We talk about reparations and repair and fix, and that's the work right there, just actually doing it when it comes to work and involving different voices. And I think in these questions, a wall of our own or Monument Lab, it's important to think about how we can foster and push for that change. So any final thoughts before we bring Kate back? And thank you again.
Yeah, I want to say a few things. One is profound gratitude. This is a public conversation, but our conversations go way back and sustain me. They pushed me. made me a better thinker, a better scholar, a better friend. So I'm just so grateful to be able to be in this moment. And as we said, it can be surreal because it's like all the other conversations we have, and it feels like it's we're talking about these finished books or talking about what's happening in the news today, but it's really a lifelong conversation.
Yes.
And so immense gratitude that is great. And just to be surrounded by, so many folks. I saw Janet Cockstein and Marnie Kerr and Brandon Jones and all these people, friends and teachers who you don't always get a chance to come full circle with. So hopefully we'll all be able to be in person together. I want to first, because I know that David Felsen wants that answer. So I will say, if there's one figure that Philadelphia could elevate in numerous ways, and I'll say, I've already mentioned Oni Judge, but I'm going to say William Still, who documented the lives of formerly enslaved African Americans when they came to Philadelphia through the Underground Railroad, and is a figure who, if we want to understand the history of Philadelphia and understand Philadelphia's role in the larger structures of freedom and injustice, William Still is a source for that. The biggest thing I want to say is, in one sense, inviting people to be a part of Monument Lab. We're at this really exciting point. We have been a passion project, and we are growing rapidly in this moment.
Oh, yes, you are.
Yeah. But, there are ways to be involved. You can follow Monument Lab on Instagram, on Twitter. You can join our mailing list. We now have a store where you can wear monuments. We partnered with Ursula Rucker, a great Germantown poet and a collaborator of ours. Our town hall is next week. You can come for a free event that we're putting on in cooperation with the German government, actually. But more so, the work, like Monument Lab as an organization, is an art project, but it's really a verb. And so if you're going to Monument Lab where you are, whether it's at GFS or in Germantown or anywhere you're joining from, it means asking questions. It means listening to different kinds of answers. And it means thinking about history and art and our civic engagement in living ways. And so this work is hard, but as I was, shared to me by a former great teacher, there's great joy in finding moments of breakthrough and seeing ways to sustain it. So I'm just so grateful for this conversation, but I put it in the context of a lifelong process with GFS, with you, Andre, with people here, that we're gonna spend our lives doing work that's urgent, and we're gonna spend our lives doing work in order to imagine who does it with us.
Wonderful. Paul, thank you so much for coming to our community and having this conversation. This event was recorded. Please send an email to the Office of Communication if you'd like to see a copy. I think we can help with that. And I'm going to close us out and turn it back over to Kate. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kate.
Paul and Andre, it has been an amazing evening. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us for our first virtual Community Writers Series event. And thanks to everyone else out there who joined us this evening. Please stay tuned, because we hope this is just the beginning and more virtual events to come. And with that, have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thanks. Bye.